The second analogy, which is the analogy about causation, is, as I indicated before, one of the most famous parts of Kant's critique of pure reason. And in fact, it's one of the parts that really got me into reading this book. So the first time I delved into the critique of pure reason, definitely one of the things where I wanted to get to was the second analogy, because I wanted to understand what Kant said about causation and about time, which are two topics very close to my own heart. In fact, I don't normally publish on Kant, but I do have an article in which I use precisely the second analogy in order to argue that a roughly Kantian theory about the relation between causation and time is correct. And in case you're interested in that, it's an article called On the Causal Nature of Time, published in this book edited by Samantha Kleinberg, Time and Causality Across the Sciences. Okay, that was my little self-promotion. I'll put details of that in the description of the video below. Okay, so let us look at this second analogy, the principle of temporal sequence according to the law of causality. And rather than read out Kant's proof, I think the most helpful way to approach this is to start out by talking about the three scenarios that Kant himself discusses, two of them at some length, one of them he briefly mentions, that thinking through the difference between these three scenarios, I think is the key to understanding what Kant does in the second analogy. And so the three scenarios that I want to talk about are a dream, the house, and the ship. Right? So these are Kant's examples. Although, in fact, because a ship can sort of go both ways, I'm going to talk about a falling apple. I think that's actually a little bit easier, a little bit more intuitive for us to understand. Okay, so first scenario, a dream. So what happens in the dream is that there is this dragon which tries to swallow me, and I run away from it. But, it blasts me with a gigantic cone of fire, and I die. Okay, so that is a sequence of states that I had, mental states that I had. One in which I believe to be, pursued by a dragon. One in which I believe to be consumed by flames. And they happened one after the other, right? Okay. The second scenario, the one that Kant talks about at some length, is when I, let's say, look at a house. Right? I look at a house and I'm not looking at like the entire house at once. I'm first focusing on the front door, and then I'm focusing on the first floor, or second floor if you're American, first floor bedroom window, and then I focus on the chimney. Okay, so there were three things there, like the door and the first floor bedroom window, and then the chimney. And again, I mean, in a sense, there was something that happened one after the other. Right? And then the third example, Kant talks about this ship, I'm going to talk about this falling apple. Right? What I see is an apple hanging in a tree, and then whew, it falls down, and with a thump, it lands on the ground and remains there. There are important differences between these three scenarios, and they have to do with objectivity, which is, of course, one of Kant's central concerns in the entire critique of pure reason. Right? All the time, Kant is interested in objective validity. When we are here in this part of the book talking about the categories, Kant believes he has proved that the categories have objective validity in the transcendental deduction, and now we are going to find out how that objective validity appears, in a sense, what it does, how we can where in our thinking about the world the objective validity of the categories is going to come in. So the distinction in terms of objectivity between these three scenarios is that in the first scenario, where I am pursued by a dragon, there is actually no object at all. There is no dragon, there is no fire. There is, to be sure, a dream, right? And we could think about this dream as an object, something that appears to me in our sense, and something that can be studied, right? And we can wonder about the causes of the dream. Maybe I read a book about dragons and so on and so forth. But that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, that's fine, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the contents of the dream, right? I perceived, or thought I perceived, is maybe a better thing to say. I had states that were like perceiving a dragon while I was dreaming, but actually there's no dragon, right? There's nothing objective about this scenario at all. Okay, the house. There is something objective here because there is a house. But what is not objective about this particular sequence of appearances that came to me, of the front door, the window, the chimney, is their time order. That was merely subjective. That merely had to do with the way that I took in this house, which was there and unchanging all the time. So although it is fine to say that my perception of the door, so this subjective state, my perception of the door, came before my perception of the chimney, it is not fine to say that the door came before the chimney. Right? There's no objective time order in the case of this surveying of the house. And then finally, in the third example, when I see an apple falling from a tree, there is an objective time order, right? First, the apple was in the tree, then it fell, then it hit the ground, then it remained lying there, right? This is an objective time order. It's not a description of my experience. It might also be a description of my experience, but it's not primarily a description of my experience. It's an objective time order there in the world. Okay, now what Kant is interested in, like the question that he asks us, is how we represent something as an objective time order. Right? We have to do that. This is something we learned in the deduction, right? I mean, the relation, like we need to sort of represent to ourselves this world of objects spread out in space and time, right? We need to represent the world as having an objective time order. Okay, we need to represent the world as having an objective time order. We do, in fact, represent the world as having an objective time order, as these three examples, which everyone will understand and which everyone will understand the difference between, shows. So we do, in fact, represent an objective time order. How? What is involved in the representation of this objective time order? Well, it's not anything in the sensation itself. Because, like, phenomenologically, like, if I just check out, okay, what are the contents of my consciousness, then what I have when I surveyed this house was I had a sequence, a succession of representations. I represented a house, a door, a window, a chimney. What I have in the case of the apple, if I merely look at my sort of at the contents of my sensation, if you wish, at what I am perceiving, again there is a succession of perceptions, right? A succession of representations. First, I represent an apple in a tree, then I represent an apple halfway between the tree and the ground, and then I represent an apple on the ground. There's no difference there. And importantly, Kant could say, what this shows us, what this illustrates for us, is that a succession of representations is not itself a representation of succession. Right? What I need is something more. I need more than just having different representations one after the other in time. That is a succession of representations. What I need is I need to represent a succession. I need to represent these events as one following the other objectively. How do I do that? Right? There's nothing, in a sense, there's nothing missing from the way that I described our perception just now. I mean, there's not a further ingredient here. Time itself, Kant is, going to say again, time itself is not something that can be perceived. So it's not like in the case of the apple, I sort of see time passing by or involved in the falling or something like that. So how do I, what is going on in representing to myself the difference of the case of the house and the difference of the case of the apple? The difference between the case of the house and the case of the apple. And Kant's answer is, what I represent in the latter case in the case of the apple, is a necessity. I think, in thinking that this is an objective time order, what I think is that these states had to follow each other in this particular order. Whereas in the case of the house, there was no necessity, right? It could have been any order. That was merely sort of happenstance. In the case of the house, the order is contingent. In the case of the apple, the order is necessary. That is the distinction between representing something as, happening one after the other subjectively but not objectively, and representing something as happening one after the other objectively, as being an objective time order. So we can see this in Kant's text, where he talks about what is going on when we represent something as objective. So, for instance, here at B236, A191, Kant says the following: appearance, in contradistinction to the representations of apprehension. So appearance is the objective thing, right? I mean, it's what appears. It's what's given. The object that is given to us is the appearance. Appearance, in contradistinction to the representations of apprehension, can thereby only be represented as the object that is distinct from them if it stands under a rule that distinguishes it from every other apprehension and makes one way of combining the manifold necessary. That in the appearance which contains the condition of this necessary rule of apprehension is the object. So the way that Kant here poses the problem is he says, okay, when I make this distinction between the house and the apple, I'm making a distinction between the merely subjective apprehensions on the one hand and the appearance as something that is distinct from my subjective apprehensions, as something that is an object on the other hand. What is this difference? Right? What is this? How can this object be given to me and yet not be identical to the subjective sequence of apprehensions? Well, it can be because it embodies a necessity. It makes one way of combining the manifold necessary. That in the appearance which contains the condition of this necessary rule of apprehension is the object. An object is that which makes it's a rule for experience, right? We've seen this again and again. And if we're interested in objective time order, okay, if there is such a thing as objective time order, and if all objects are supposed to be part of this objective time order, and they are supposed to be part of an objective time order because they're all supposed to be ordered in time, therefore all objects must be or embody, be I think is what Kant says here, or contain is maybe Kant's word here, contain the conditions of a necessary rule for apprehension that is a necessary rule for ordering the apprehensions in time. And a necessary rule for ordering the apprehensions in time, that is something that says after A you must have B, after B you must have C, things like that, is of course precisely what the law of causality is for Kant, what the category of causality does. Right? Causality is about one thing having to follow from something else. So this, in a nutshell, is Kant's argument. So here he doesn't bring in time in the quote I just gave, but he does bring in time 2 pages later at B238, A193, where he says, this connection must therefore consist in the order of the manifold of appearance, in accordance with which the apprehension of one thing, that which happens, follows that of the other, which proceeds, in accordance with a rule. Only thereby can I be justified in saying of the appearance itself, and not merely of my apprehension, that a sequence is to be encountered in it. Which is to say as much that I cannot arrange the apprehension otherwise than in exactly this sequence. And this seems to me exactly right. I mean, at least it is exactly right if we follow Kant in conceiving of objects as he does, right? As soon as we conceive of objects as that which makes a certain synthesis of the manifold necessary, then objective time order is having rules for how things, how appearances have to follow each other in time. And given that all objects have to be in time, this means that all objects have to follow under such rules. And that is a proof of the principle of causation, or what Kant takes to be the principle of causation. The second analogy is actually sort of rather long, and I'm not going to talk about most of the second part of it, because Kant is going to sort of veer off into several directions to talk about, causes that happen at the same time, and he will tell us that there is still a sort of priority there, that there's still sort of a symmetry there. He talks about questions of whether, like temporal asymmetry, why we would say that in cause it's one thing that has to follow another, not one thing that has to precede another. And basically Kant's argument for that is that we experience time as sort of moving forward, as one thing leading to something else. He has a story about the law of continuity of all alteration, which maybe from our current perspective is a little bit more dubious. The idea that there can't be like jumps in reality, that causation couldn't sort of instantly change one thing from a value here to a value over there. Okay, Kant apparently thinks that it follows from what he has said about causation so far. So many of these topics, by the way, which appear here in the second half of the second analogy, are topics that would still be discussed by philosophers of causation nowadays, right? Who might be really interested in whether there is simultaneous causation, for instance, and who are really interested in the relation between causation on the one hand and something like the arrow of time on the other hand, right? The arrow of causation from cause to effect and the arrow of time from past to future. What is the relation between them? Now, one of the reasons that I think the second analogy is so important to philosophers nowadays still is that Kant takes up a position here, works out a position, and gives, I think, a rather powerful argument in favor of a position, albeit within sort of his whole philosophical system, which of course not that many people would accept. But okay, it's a very powerful argument for a conception of the relation between causation and time that is not very prominent in contemporary thinking about causation and time. So let me say a little bit about that. And I mean, now I'm veering a little bit away from Kant and into my own areas of specialization, really, the kind of things that I think about and talk about and write about all the time. But here's a way that philosophers nowadays tend to think about the relation between causation and time. In general, they would say that time is more fundamental than causation. In the following sense, right? What we would first have to conceive of, and what we can first conceive of, is a spatio-temporal world filled with events, right? Think of a world. What do you think of? You think of space and time, and there are events spread out through space and time. And now we can start asking questions about causation. Right? Is there any causation in this world? Where is there causation in this world? Does this thing cause this other thing? Well, a lot of the theories about causation are going to say, okay, assume that like the spatio-temporal way in which things are spread out. Now we can think about where the causal relations are between the events in this world. And so the underlying presupposition is that we can understand time without understanding causation. And that is something that Kant, I think, is really is putting a really big question mark next to here in the second analogy. Because basically Kant is saying, well, if you have the idea of an objective time order, the idea of objects in time, you already have the idea of causation, right? It is nothing else than the idea of causation. An objective time order and rules for how things necessarily succeed each other. That's the same thing. And if you think that you can conceive of one without the other, you are in fact wrong. Right? And maybe one of the things, this is not what Kant says, but this is what I would say, maybe one of the things that is going wrong is that you are sort of imagining time as space. Right? And you are thinking of things in time as things arranged in space along this line of time. You think, okay, I can easily think of that without thinking about causation, but you're not thinking time. And so, what I love about the second analogy is the way in which Kant's whole story about objectivity suddenly sort of flares up here into this, I would say, brilliant insight about the interrelation between time and causation. Like objects in time and objects being causally connected, essentially being the same thing. These two seemingly very different notions of time and causality, completely inextricably linked. All right. Okay. So I talked a little bit about what the fundamental argument of the second analogy is, and I talked, I guess, also for a long time about why I think it's fascinating and the kind of role that it could and should play, according to me, in contemporary philosophy. I hope that is helpful to you. I hope it also allows you sort of a glimpse of the continued relevance of Kant, which I haven't been talking about much in most of the other lectures. All right, so next time we move on to simultaneity. Things not happening one after the other, but things happening at the same time.